Reno and beyond for joining us today. If you aren't already familiar with Black Mountain Institute, we aim to bring writers and the literary imagination into the heart of the public. We do this by way of our year-round events like this one, through fellowships, through student enrichment opportunities, and through innovative media like the Believer magazine, Witness magazine, and Black Mountain Radio. Before we get started, a few reminders. Please mark your calendars for upcoming events. Next week, on Tuesday, October 5th at 7 p.m., celebrate City of Asylum's 20th anniversary in an evening with BMI's fellows featuring Ahmed Naji, Jorge Castillo, Amanda Fortini, Felita Hicks, and Mary South. Our generous bookstore, The Writer's Block, is offering a book bundle, which includes our fellows' books. You can order it through the customized link in the chat. On Saturday, October 23rd, join our two sharing fellows at the Las Vegas Book Festival for Literary Oasis, following Voices of Literary and Wonder with Felita Hicks and Mary South, moderated by poet Shrestha Sen. Purchase a copy of Cherie Jones's book at the Writer's Block, and the link will be in the chat. After the moderated discussion, Cherie will be taking questions at the end, so please enter your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Sign up for these events and learn more about the rest of BMI's full season at blackmountaininstitute.org. The links will be in the chat. Cherie S.A. Jones was born in 1974. She received a law degree from the University of the West Indies, Barbados in 1995, a legal education certificate from the Hugh Wooding Law School, St. Augustine, Trinidad in 1997, and was admitted to the bar in Barbados in October 1997. Jones won the Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 1999. She won both the Archie Markham Award and the A.M. Heath Prize at Sheffield Hallam in the UK. Her collection of interconnected stories set in a different small community in Barbados, Water for the End of the World, won a third prize at the Frank Collymore Endowment Awards in 2016. She still works as a lawyer in addition to her writing. Moderating this conversation is Soni Brown. Soni Brown is a writer from Jamaica, now in the final year of completing her MFA in creative nonfiction at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Brown's work centers primarily on the idea of home and the connections immigrants make while living in new homelands. Her writing is supported by the Nevada Humanities, Desert Companion, The Believer, and Salt Lake City. Please help me welcome through the chat, Cherie Jones and Soni Brown.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much. Welcome, Cherie Jones. So happy to be here sitting in Las Vegas in a boardroom right above BMI to talk to you. I want to get right into this novel with the time we have. The novel starts out with this cautionary tale of a girl who chooses adventure over obedience, the consequences of which are life-altering. Yet the fable does not stop the main character, Lala, from the moral sin of daring to reach beyond her natural limitations. My experience of the West Indies, being from there, at least when I was growing up in Jamaica, was that we were always supposed to aim for a financially abundant life abroad. And even Lala, to some extent, and Tone, fantasized about leaving Barbados. What made you include this plot point?
Thank you, Soni. It's so wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me. Now, the aim or the intention within the Caribbean to leave for a better life has been a part of our history for as long as I can remember. And including this point, I think, was important, one, for the authenticity of the story. I mean, so many locals here who live in, financially straitened circumstances do dream of leaving the Caribbean for a better life abroad. And I think because of the lives that Lala and Tone are, are living when we meet them in the novel, that this really is an option for them both, and it would be something that they would have both considered at one point in time.
That's really neat, this whole idea of putting that in. And I was really grateful to see it, because I think in a lot of West Indian literature, there's always like, life is paradise, so why leave it? And in the story, the characters, or at least the character like Lala, came to you as you commuted home on an evening bus in London. I wanted to go into that a little bit more. Your characters are informed by your experience as a West Indian woman, including intimate partner violence. Do you think you would have been able to conjure Lala or any of the other characters in Barbados on the beach in the sunshine? Or were the conditions on that bus so formidable, being in England with the weather, lovely weather? Do you think the conditions made Lala speak to you on the ride home then more so than anywhere else?
That's a really good question. I actually don't think I know. I don't know. I can't say that if I had been at home in Barbados in the sunshine at that point in time, that that story and that character would not have come to me. I think, I am of the view that my stories choose me, and there's no rhyme or reason to it as far as I can tell. So, I get stories anywhere. I could be overseas, away from Barbados. I could be in Barbados. I could be on a bus. I could be at lunch. I could be in a meeting. Stories just come to me. So I really can't say that the fact of being away from Barbados actually sort of helped this story to come to me. I certainly do think, however, that it helped me in writing it. And I say that because for me, as a person from the Caribbean, I've found that whenever I've moved abroad, and I have lived abroad for particular periods of time, whether it's to pursue further studies or just to move there to live, and somehow Barbados always becomes very sharp in my mind when I'm away from it. I remember on one occasion being in the UK and just dreaming about going to the beach at home. And what was strange about that for me is that I am one of those Bajans who, at home, I take the beach for granted. Like, it's beautiful, it's right there. I don't go to the beach every evening after work, nor do I try to get there, every opportunity that I can. But certainly I found myself when I was in the UK kind of daydreaming about it, and the detail of it, some of the sort of aspects of our culture would just kind of, come to me in very sort of strong ways that I couldn't ignore. So I do think being away from home helped me to write the story, but I can't say that, my location impacted actually receiving that story. I don't know.
There is an Indigenous writer in Arkansas, Toni Jensen, who writes about things being kept in the flesh, like trauma being kept in the flesh. And I thought about that very much when you were describing the scenes of paradise, when you're describing the beaches and everything else. And ironically, much of the violence in the novel is set near or on a tropical beach, what tourists consider paradise, which is also the name of the town where the very famous Las Vegas Strip sits on. It's in Paradise. And like Baxter Beach in the novel, Las Vegas is a tourist haven with a series of tunnels underneath that only a few people venture into. And in the novel, visiting and living in Paradise seems to recognize this limited perspective each group has of the other. Mm-hmm. Here in Las Vegas, people think we live in casinos, right?
Right.
In Barbados, I wonder, people probably think that everyone lives on the beach or near the beach. Yes.
Yeah.
Why did you choose a tourist industry as a backdrop to the characters and not, say, the sugar industry?
It's another good question. So for me, there were a number of reasons, I think, why I chose the beach as the setting for this novel. One of them was just sort of a natural progression once I understood the story as I felt I had received it. So when I first heard from or met Lala's character, for example, and I recognized that she was a hair braider, the beach in Barbados was where you would see lots of hair braiders, say in the 1980s when this story is set. So just by virtue of who I understood Lala to be, the beach was going to play a part in that. But I think in crafting this story, it was also important for me because the beach is the one place in Barbados. We're such a small place and we're surrounded by water on all sides. And I think every Barbadian has a relationship with the beach, whether they acknowledge it or not. It is one of the best things about living here. There also is a very strong sense of being in a small place and being on a small island and being kind of boxed in. So I think that was the second reason, because the beach is the one place in Barbados that everybody from every sector of society has visited or has some interaction with or feeling about. I think the beach touches everybody's lives, and therefore for the story that I was telling, it made sense for the beach to be the setting, in that way as well. And then I just think I have a personal deep connection with the sea that I think I explore in several of my stories and several of my bits of writing. And in this novel, that wasn't any different. I do feel a special connection with the sea, and it's almost as if in the book the beach becomes a character. I mean, the beach has a mood at particular points, and it depends on what's happening in the novel. And in so many ways, what happens on and to the beach, and the relationship that the beach has with paradise, mirrors the relationship that the characters have with themselves and with each other. So I think this story just made sense to be set on the beach. To me, I don't think, based on the story that I was telling, that perhaps the sugar industry would have been an appropriate sort of backdrop or context.
I love it. I love it. I want to shift to Lala and Adan's relationship. My sense is that you wrote the relationship as a true cautionary tale, not so much the fable in the beginning. And it's a cautionary tale for young women in the West Indies, especially, given the level of violence that happens between them. These two characters speak and interact in a way that is more familiar to my West Indian side than my American side. Is that deliberate? And are you code switching for the audience?
So, in terms of the relationship between Lala and Aiden, I wouldn't say that I started off intending to write a cautionary tale. I think once I understood the story that I was writing, of necessity, I had to deal with certain themes, and I had to explore certain aspects of that relationship. And even, the fact that a relationship like that is not unique within my community or within Paradise, the Paradise of the novel. So the relationship between Lala and Aiden was important to develop and to explore, so that I think readers get a full appreciation of what that relationship entails, and perhaps can ask some questions about what a relationship like that says about our understanding of gender, for example, or performance of gender, this sort of hierarchy of gender within our context, and what that means for women and their ability to fully self-realize in that context. So I think it was important to explore a relationship like that, because relationships like that exist, and I dare say are pretty commonplace here, as in other parts of the world. So it was really important to do that. Now, when you talk about code switching, I wonder if you could sort of clarify for me what you mean when you say that, if I was code switching for the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the scene with Seiton, he is a sex worker. And usually when you think of sex work and tourism, you think of women.
You think of women,
girls.
Yeah.
But where I'm from, sex workers and tourists usually mean it's the men, the local men, and it's foreign women. And we even have a term for it called rent-a-dread.
Yes, I've heard that expression. Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
So there are a lot of things that I picked up on that I don't know if I would have picked up on if I was purely coming from an American perspective. For instance, her braiding the hair, that crisscross she makes braiding the hair, and where it's like leftover, stop, all that.
Yes.
Like I remember listening to you read it earlier, and I remember reading it and actually doing it. Like, did she get was it a 3-stamp, stuff like that? What they cook, how when someone comes in and you ask, have you eaten, as one of the first things, or how the greetings are. There were like little things like that, even down to the clothes the grandmother was wearing when she came from the hospital, like the hat. I know women who wear those hats, you know, they're your good church hat that you wear to wear out.
That you wear out.
So there are all these little things that I thought I was picking up on that seemed like written for me, and maybe you wrote them in so that I would get it, but it might just be like, oh, she's wearing clothes with a hat, but why would you wear your good clothes to go to the hospital? But I know why you'd wear your good clothes to go to the hospital, because that's our culture.
Right. So, and that goes, I think, really to the heart of who I am as a writer and how I wrote this story. I mean, this story is unapologetically a Bajan story. And I am a writer from this part of the world, and I very strongly resist any suggestion that I write from a margin or from margins, because to me that presupposes that there is something which is central and which is other than who I am and where I'm writing from. Now, when I write and I write from my perspective, and I see through the lens of the life that I've lived. And that means being from the Caribbean, and that means experiencing certain aspects of our culture. And I've learned to be unapologetic about that. So in writing this story, I didn't kind of set out to say, okay, let me put these elements in that people who are from the Caribbean region will understand. I just wrote this story because that was true to the story, and that is true to the story that I was writing about, the characters I'm writing about through the lens that I am using from my perspective, from my place in the world. So, you know, there's no sort of attempt to write in things that people would recognize. I'm just writing this story just as I saw it, And that is what would happen in this part of the world. So like you say, rent to dread is real. I've had people say to me, oh my gosh, did you have to put that in there? Like, isn't that like the stereotype, the Rasta gigolo on the beach? And I said, well, have you seen him? Like, have you ever seen a person like that? And have you ever read their story? And if you haven't, then perhaps it's high time that that story was represented in our body of literature. So there's no sort of I'm not writing and putting in markers for people who are from the region to understand. I'm just writing the story that came to me from my perspective, from my corner of the world.
I want to go into this whole idea of West Indian literature, post-colonialism, while we're trying to figure out what makes our work literature on par with everywhere else. Everyone knows Marlon James, or I should say Marlon James is a well-known name.
Yes.
He gave a lecture at a festival, a literary festival, I think in Glasgow a couple of years ago. And he talked about how, mind you, he was talking about Jamaican literature, but he talked about how a lot of it is very stereotypical. It's about like, I was raised in the country and I was raised very poor. And he wanted literature of the middle class, of the everyday person. And I think like your story tells a very wide view of a story in the islands that people don't normally get to see. Indeed, there are many of our stories that people just don't get to see.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the English-speaking countries in the West Indies attained self-rule in 1962, and in Barbados, I think 1966.
66, yeah.
Ah, yes, my history teacher, Mrs. Mathis, will be happy.
She's proud, yes.
How do you think literary fiction is playing a role in explorations of the West Indian identity when the aesthetic and artistic development of the literary artist is still happening? We're only 50 plus years outside of being British citizenship and under British rule. How are we shaping out to be your own literary analysis and artists and theorists?
So, I was kind of examining that subject in the, within the very narrow context actually of books about domestic violence, or books that have addressed the theme of domestic violence in Caribbean literature. And one of the things I think, even with the same novel from Roger Mays that we talked about earlier, The Hills Were Joyful Together, I think when that book came out, Caribbean literature was largely concerned with the sort of delineation of a self and a nationhood, a sense of identity as a people, a legitimacy in terms of our story and what we were saying about it. So, there were several writers immediately pre-independence. If you look at independence as, say, the 1960s, generally for quite a few of the islands in the Anglophone Caribbean, that would be the case in terms of when independence happened. And for a lot of those novels immediately prior to independence and, say, immediately post-independence, it was about defining who we are as a nation, as a people. And I think what happened is that because, we focused on things like the legitimacy, for example, of writing about the yard. You want to write the yard story. Those characters we wanted to let everyone understand that character is just as worthy of being the subject of a story as any character from anywhere else in the world. And we wanted to define who we were and what we were aspiring to. And I think in doing so, there were some parts of our story that perhaps were not acknowledged, not there was less attention in terms of developing that aspect of our identity. And I do think concerns about women, including domestic violence, would have been one of those areas that, that just wasn't really treated well, or I don't want to say well in terms of quality, but not treated, not explored extensively, because we were so focused on defining who we were as a people and as a nation. I think with time, in the past 50 years or so, we've started to go beyond that. And I would actually posit that we have recognized to a certain extent that the delineation of who we are as a people starts with the recognition and the delineation of self. And I think we looked at it the other way around independence. We were aspiring towards these big goals as it relates to community and nationhood and who we were. And now I think we're recognizing that we also need to focus on who we are individually, to aspire towards certain ideals, even in our literature, and thereby to transform the community. And it doesn't work the other way around. So yes, I think as time has gone on, we've definitely spread our wings in terms of the subject matter that we treat in our literature. But I think it really is doing a lot more than we perhaps give it credit for in terms of developing us as a people.
Wholeheartedly agree. I'm amazed at the work that is coming out of this tiny little space. And forgive me for asking you to speak for all West Indians, but
No, I understand, and I don't claim to. I can kind of speak for myself and what I've observed, and I think that's probably something that other people would recognize, and then there'll be others who won't agree with me. So that's life.
We have a few more questions, and I'll try not to get into the too deep, like meta questions. And I say meta because my good friend, well, not my good friend, but one of my colleagues, Sylvia Fox, had to explain what meta meant. And ever since she did, I use it in whatever conversations I can. What is your ethos or organizing principle for your writing?
What is my ethos? I think at the base of my writing is an appreciation for the value of storytelling in changing and developing the individual and therefore humanity. I'm one of those people that I take my storytelling very, very seriously. A story is like a safe space. It's a part of our culture. I mean, we live by stories. We live by stories and we die by them. And I really think that storytelling is the medium that is perhaps one of the most effective in bringing about change. And I therefore take my responsibility as a writer very, very seriously. And that informs my work. I am about, how can I be of service to the story that I've received? How can I bring the best of my abilities in terms of crafting to this story? And how can I therefore help to fully realize it in a way that is of benefit to myself and to other people? So I take, my responsibility as a storyteller very, very seriously. It's really soul work for me.
I feel like I want to give you a siren to put on top of your car and just have it go around going, wee, 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 storyteller, wee, wee, wee. Out, come out. It's been a long day, What's your writing ritual like? Do you write it out or wait for inspiration to come?
Yeah, so my ritual is can be different things at different times depending on what's happening. Okay, so generally speaking, in terms of, you know, if I have something that I'm working on, and I'm in that sort of steady, consistent flow, I will get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and write for a few hours until it's time to leave and go to work. Now, having said that, if I hear a character or feel I receive a story anywhere at any time, I'm going to start trying to jot it down. But in terms of the actual real work and development, I'm like an early morning person. I also tend to, I do have a quirk of writing first drafts in longhand and writing from the back to the front of whatever writer's notebook that I have. So I'll say that I write from the back of the notebook to the front as opposed to the other way around. I'm not sure what that is about, but you did ask. So that is, so, you know, at other points in time, and there have been times where I've been through writer's block. I just feel uninspired. Nothing is coming to me. What I do in those instances is I tend to try to do something else creative. It's almost as if I'm trying to, I don't want to say trick the muse, but it's something like that. I will focus on something else artistic. I'm really into photography. I'll do that. There are other things that I will do to try to get that sense back of you know, being open and aware and ready to tell whatever story I might be interested with. At different points in my career, I've actually just, you know, given up everything and gone to pursue my writing as well. So be that going to a writer's colony. I've just taken my entire holiday and gone to writer's colony. I've sort of quit my job and gone to pursue an MA in writing. So it's different things at different times depending on the project. I usually have more than one project going, and I have to say I don't not write. So, you know, this is a funny one because these stories are different. So, for example, I've had writer's block on occasion, and I started writing flash fiction as a way to get around that. A colleague suggested it to me when I was doing my MA, and I was stuck. I was doing a bigger project. I was stuck, and he said, you know, do you know about this? Would you like to? Maybe you can try it, and so on. And I started coming up with these really sort of magical stories, 300 words or less. And those stories didn't actually, you know, a character didn't kind of come into my head. There was that sort of sense of sitting and inviting something to come through. So, but generally speaking, yeah, I have to be receiving a story to really be getting into it.
I'll ask you some questions from the audience. This first one comes from CB. He or she or they say, thank you so much for this talk. I'd love to know more about what books inform your work.
Right. So, wow, there's so many. Lots of Caribbean authors, V.S. Naipaul, Roger Mayes, Olive Senior, Jamaica Kincaid. Farther afield, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker. I love short stories. So Ian Lee, Amy Bender. Wow, there's so many books and stories and authors that I think have influenced the way I write and who I am as a writer.
Yeah, I think if you're from the West Indies, Olive Senior informs all your work because it's required reading in primary school and high
yes,
school.
yes.
Yes,
Lovelace as well. Earl Lovelace. I mean,
Yes.
there's some books that by Caribbean authors that I remember reading for the first time, and just, I just wasn't the same after I read. And The Wine of Astonishment was one of those books for me by Earl Lovelace. It's absolutely one of my favorites.
Yes, you should all seek Olive Senior and Lovelace. You should all do that. Be so blessed. Sylvia Fox, the one who taught me the word meta, she says, I'm interested in the timestamps of these chapters, how and why time is marked in this way. I love that we are reminded not only that a new voice was commencing, but that these interactions were happening at a particular point in time, and that all of these voices coexist in time. It reminded me of how one might mark time in a diary, which I felt added to the closeness, the intimacy that each section conveyed. I was wondering if you could speak to the choice to mark time in that way. It's a great question.
Yes. So, there's this way we tell stories in the Caribbean. If you have a friend who's telling you a story about the fete that happened last night and who they saw at the fete, they're gonna tell you, well, like I went down to Penthouse and the fete was real good, and this particular DJ was playing and things were getting real heated, and then I saw Charlie. You know Charlie, right? And the other person that said, no, I don't know. You know Charlie. Charlie is the man. His grandmother used to run that shop down in the corner, whatever. So when we tell stories in the Caribbean, for the part of the tradition that I'm from, we don't just tell the story about the thing. We gotta stop this story at different points, and we gotta tell you a story about the other people so that you understand the story that we're telling. So we're gonna go all around, and it was important for me to do that in telling this novel, especially in writing this novel, especially because in order to tell Lala's story properly, I felt you had to tell the stories of several of the people before her and the stories of some of the characters around her. And it was kind of difficult to do that smoothly because there is that sort of jumping backwards and forwards depending on what's happening at that point in time. So I thought a timestamp, was helpful in terms of sort of marking this is the era, that we're now in, and this is this person's story at this particular point in time. So I think that was one of the reasons. I also think because this story shifts so much, and in structuring this story, I think in order to be able to tell Lala's story, to have the reader truly empathize with her, I did feel that I wanted the reader to have a sense of that, not being on steady ground, not quite sure of what's what and what's happening when, concepts like time and space and what is beautiful and what isn't beautiful and what's love and what isn't love. Everything gets a little blurred for people in Lala's circumstances. And I had to balance that shifting sand. I wanted the reader not to feel as grounded as they might have, say, if the story was more linear. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, it really helped to be able to balance that with the ability to say to the reader, to signal, okay, now we're going back. So you're not quite settled, but you also know, you get a warning, okay, now we're going back to this particular point in time. So I think that was one of the reasons for including those timestamps in there.
Anjan Jawali says or asks, what do you enjoy about writing stories in a novel format? Do you feel there is anything you can convey in this novel that you couldn't convey in a different format?
Right. So we had a discussion about form today. Right. Right. So one of the things that I would have said is I don't actually start out, and I know this might sound a little strange, but I start out with the intention of writing a story, not a novel or a short story necessarily. I might think, and I think prior to writing this novel, did think that the short story was, the form with which I was most comfortable. And, I felt I could probably be of greater service in writing a short story. This novel just absolutely challenged me on that front. So when I wrote that first draft in 2008, I thought I was, when I finished, I thought it was a short story. I looked at it and thought, well, it's a short story about this particular moment when this couple is fighting over this baby. And then as time went on, that short story just got longer, and it kind of became clear to me that the story needed more space to breathe, to really be fully realized, and to have the impact that I think it could have had, or that I thought it should have at that point in time. A short story just wasn't the appropriate form, to the extent that I think of form in that way, which, for me wasn't a consideration at the beginning. I was just writing a story. There might have been a part of that story, if it was appropriate for this story, that I might have broken into verse, for example, or, use some other form. Form really is in service to the story for me. And I will say that I do think perhaps, or I did think perhaps at one point in my career, that I was better at writing short stories than anything else. And therefore, a lot of my stories tended to be short stories. But this one was challenging in that regard. And eventually, I think I realized somewhere around 2015, this needs a novel. This story needs a novel, needs the space that a novel affords in order to breathe.
And Francesca asked, is a cautionary tale at the beginning of the story a tale that you heard growing up in Barbados, or similar to any tale you heard growing up? Or is it a tale you created? I love how vivid and strong of a tale it is. Loving this book. Thank you for this talk.
Well, thank you. So no, the myth at the beginning of this story is made up for this story. Having said that, the tradition of telling stories of that type to children for that purpose is definitely not made up. That's a part of our culture. So when I was younger, for example, in order to sort of scare children away from going outside past a certain time at night when it's dark and perhaps it could be dangerous, we'd be told stories about the grease man, for example. Now, I can't really tell you what the grease man looks like, what his origins are, who he's related to. I just knew from hearing that story that I was supposed to be really afraid of him, and meeting him after 6 or 7 o'clock at night on the street was a fate worse than death. And that is what a lot of, Caribbean parents do. You give this really scary story with this character that, the child is just scared stiff to encounter, and therefore you inspire, I'm going to use the word inspire euphemistically, but you inspire obedience on the part of children. So that tradition is very much alive and well in the Caribbean, and the myth was made up within that context.
That reminds me of being told about the dark heart man in Jamaica. Like, he goes around ripping out the hearts of children if they find you on the street after dark. And I'm like,
yes, the heart man.
Why?
Yes, there's a grease man, there's a heart man, there's just, there are all these characters that scared the what's it out of children. Yes,
that's for sure. Still went out after dark, didn't care.
Neither did Lala, apparently.
Like, so if anyone from the islands or anyone who tells these stories to children is out there, this does not work. Stop telling those scary stories. Shani asks, thank you for this talk, or rather she says, thank you for this talk. What's the first thing you do when you realize you finished writing the whole story of what happened down and it's time for you to edit? That's a great question.
The first thing I do is try to separate myself from it for a little while, from that story, because, you know, at that point, I think I have a certain level of investment in the characters. And that editing stage requires a ruthlessness that might be difficult to execute properly if I'm still that invested. The other thing is that, you know, I've been in the position of writing something and finishing a manuscript and putting it down and thinking it was the absolute best that I could do and it's wonderful. And then coming back to it 3 months later or 6 months later and cringing to think that, you know, I thought this was actually finished, or this was, you know, the best that I could do. So I think there is a lot of benefit to be had from just letting that story rest for a bit before coming back to it to start the editing process. So that's what I'd say. I put it down.
What are you working on next?
Right. So I'm working on 2 things at the moment. One is a collection of flash fiction about parts of the body. And the other is another novel about a little 8-year-old girl called Niv, who lives on a cocoa plantation in Trinidad. Yes.
That sounds like a really, like, I can't even understand where that could go in terms of, there's so many places.
Yeah, she's a really precocious little girl, and it's just around the middle of the 19th century. And there's some interesting things that happen. I was just saying to somebody recently, it starts out with her caretaker acknowledging the fact that she burned down a barn, a building. She's burnt a building. So she is, you know, a child who's ahead of her time in so many ways, and she's ostracized because of it. So far that story has been a real joy to write. I will also say it's been a fairly difficult project because of the time in which it's set. So I'm having to do a lot more research, I think, than I did for previous projects.
Does the audience have any more questions? Cherie, I'm just going to say, you would have loved it here in Las Vegas. We would have taken you out to eat somewhere fancy. Fancy. There's some fancy.
Oh, maybe sometime in future. That would be wonderful.
Yes, maybe on the next release.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Charlie.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cherie Jones.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to you, Cherie Jones, and thank you to our moderator, Soni Brown. Thank you to all the attendees in Vegas and Reno and beyond for joining us today. Please support our indie bookstore, The Writer's Block, and tonight's author by purchasing How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House. And the link will be in the chat for that. So thank you and good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.